The Hegemon Coalition had ruled the galactic Northwest Corridor for 3,000 years, which sounds impressive until you realize that's roughly how long it takes their bureaucracy to approve a new starship hull design. 7 species, each more advanced than the last, each more convinced of their evolutionary superiority, had formed what they generously called a voluntary association of enlightened civilizations. The voluntary part was debatable. The enlightened part was hilarious. The Athani brought their gravitational manipulation technology and an insufferable tendency to explain things in excruciating detail. The Vothreks contributed quantum computing arrays and a cultural obsession with efficiency that made accountants look spontaneous. The Helgrim offered bioengineering marvels and the personality of wet cardboard. The Praethos provided dimensional folding drives and enough philosophical pontificating to bore a statue. The Nex added antimatter containment systems and social hierarchies, so rigid they made caste systems look flexible. The Ulvan had psionic dampening fields and all the warmth of a tax audit. The Fortham rounded out the group with energy shielding and the diplomatic charm of a parking violation. Together they'd conquered 12 other species through a combination of technological superiority and strongly worded demands. Warfare, in their enlightened view, should be brief, surgical, and conducted with appropriate respect for the established order. Wars lasted 3 years maximum. Casualties were kept under acceptable thresholds determined by actuarial tables, and surrender came with predetermined terms. Civilization, they insisted, demanded rule. Then humanity achieved faster than light travel, and the universe learned what happens when you don't read the room. Humans had been spacefaring for exactly 43 years when they bumped into the Hegemon Coalition's border. 43 years. Most coalition species spent longer than that arguing about first contact protocols. But there they were, these bizarre bipedal creatures made of meat and bad decisions, hauling ore out of a disputed asteroid field in the outer veil like they owned the place. The Coalition's first diplomatic message was a masterpiece of condescension. It essentially said, "Welcome to civilization, children. Hand over those 3 systems you've been playing in, and we'll teach you how grown-ups behave." Humanity's response was 2 words, one of which wasn't suitable for diplomatic channels, and the other was no. The Coalition blinked. Species didn't say no. Species weighed their technological disadvantage, calculated the probability of survival, and made the sensible choice. That was how civilization worked. Humanity sent a follow-up message that roughly translated to, "Come and take them." Private First Class Wyatt Chen stood in the staging bay of the UHNS Defiance, checking his rifle for the 14th time because 13 felt unlucky and 15 felt excessive. Around him 200 other Marines performed the same ritual, that peculiar liturgy of soldiers who know they're about to do something monumentally stupid and want their equipment to at least cooperate during the stupidity. The briefing had been wonderfully optimistic in that special military way, where officers tell you everything's fine while simultaneously issuing last wills and testament forms. The Coalition fleet had 7 dreadnoughts, each the size of a small moon, each packed with technology humanity wouldn't invent for another century. Humanity had 43 destroyers held together with spite, desperation, and some truly creative engineering violation. The smart play was surrender. The expected play was negotiation. Humanity, with characteristic wisdom, chose violence. "You think they'll actually asked the private next to him, a lanky kid from the Europa colonies who'd enlisted because mining asteroids paid terribly and at least the military offered hazard pay. They jumped into our system with enough firepower to glass a continent," Wyatt replied, securing his helmet. "I'm guessing they didn't come for the tourism." "Yeah, but like civilized aliens don't just murder people, right? There's got to be rules." Wyatt had read the intelligence reports. The Coalition did have rules, lovely rules. Rules about acceptable casualty ratios and proper surrender protocols, and the correct way to admit you'd been conquered. Rules that assumed everyone played the same game. Humanity had never been good at following rules, especially ones they hadn't agreed to. The Coalition fleet arranged itself in a textbook formation, maximizing firing arcs while minimizing vulnerable approach vectors. It was beautiful. Really, a 3-dimensional chess problem solved by minds that had perfected warfare into an art form. Each ship knew its role, each weapon system calibrated for precise, overwhelming force. They broadcast one final demand: surrender or be reduced to constituent atoms in an educational demonstration of coalition's superiority. Humanity's response came not through diplomatic channels but through action, which should have been everyone's first clue that this wasn't going to follow the script. The human fleet scattered like startled fish, no formation, no apparent strategy, just 43 ships burning in 43 different directions at velocities that should have liquefied their crews. Coalition sensors tracked them with the patience of a teacher watching students make obvious mistakes. Then the missiles arrived. Not from the ships, from the asteroid field they'd been mining, from the orbital stations, from the debris that turned out to not be debris, from everywhere and nowhere, thousands of dumb, simple, kinetic kill vehicles that cost approximately nothing to build and everything to stop. The Coalition's energy shields were designed to deflect particle beams and plasma torpedoes, sophisticated weapons that behaved predictably. They were not designed for what amounted to very fast rocks with guidance systems. Some shields overloaded. Some, it didn't matter, because while the Coalition fleet was busy calculating intercept trajectories, the human ships had looped back around using the star's gravity well, burned straight through their own missile swarm, and opened fire at point-blank range with railguns. The Coalition used directed energy weapons and antimatter warheads. Humans strapped magnets to tubes and threw metal very, very hard. It was like watching someone bring a sword to a laser fight and somehow win because they stabbed you with it while you were explaining why swords were obsolete. The battle lasted 6 hours. Coalition doctrine said it should have lasted 30 minutes. When it ended, 2 Coalition dreadnoughts were crippled, 1 was destroyed, and the rest retreated in what their after-action reports generously called a tactical reposition. Humanity lost 19 ships, and celebrated like they'd won. In the Defiance's ready room, Wyatt cleaned his rifle, which he hadn't even fired. The ship-to-ship combat had ended before the Marines could deploy. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt the peculiar certainty that this was just the beginning, and the beginning was going to be the easy part. Across the galaxy, the Coalition convened an emergency session. The humans had violated 17 conventions of civilized warfare, employed tactics that were borderline atrocities, and achieved a tactical victory that shouldn't have been possible. The Coalition, with unanimous agreement, decided to teach these upstart primitives a proper lesson. They mobilized their full military might, drew up invasion plans, and prepared for a war that would last the traditional 3 years. They were right about the war, wrong about everything else. The Coalition's second offensive involved actual planning, which already made it more sophisticated than their first attempt. 17 battle groups, coordinated strikes across 8 systems, and a ground invasion force large enough to conquer a solar system. The strategy was elegant, overwhelming force applied with surgical precision, targeting military infrastructure, while minimizing collateral damage. Very civilized, very proper. Humanity took one look at the invasion plans, which they'd acquired through means the intelligence community called creative signal interception, and everyone else called hacking, and decided that civilization was overrated. The first Coalition landing force touched down on Titan Station, expecting resistance at the spaceport. They got resistance at the spaceport, the maintenance tunnels, the civilian quarters, the water recycling plant, and one memorable incident in the cafeteria, where someone had weaponized the coffee machine. Apparently superheated liquid pumped through pressurized systems made excellent improvised defenses. Who knew? Humans knew. Humans had been figuring out creative ways to kill each other since they'd discovered rocks were heavy. Wyatt found himself in Habitat 7, a glorified tin can buried 300 meters into an asteroid, fighting what the Coalition called a pacification operation, and what humanity called Tuesday. The Coalition troops advanced in formation, suppressing fire laid down with mathematical precision, each soldier knowing their exact role in the tactical ballet. The human defenders fought like rabid animals, who'd read guerrilla warfare manuals, and decided the manuals weren't mean enough. Traps everywhere. Ambushes from impossible angles. The environmental controls kept fluctuating between freezing and boiling, because someone had figured out how to weaponize the thermostat. Coalition sensors couldn't track human soldiers because the humans had covered themselves in thermal blankets, local ore dust, and apparently stopped bathing, which turned out to be surprisingly effective camouflage. "They're in the walls," a coalition soldier reported, which was accurate. Humans had crawled into the maintenance shafts, the ventilation systems, anywhere that technically counted as space you could squeeze a body into. The coalition had designed their own ships with proper corridors and logical layout. Humans designed their habitats like three-dimensional rat mazes, because apparently someone thought that was efficient. The battle for Habitat 7 lasted 2 weeks. Coalition doctrine allocated 36 hours. They won, technically, by holding the command center and the main reactor. The humans abandoned both, sealed themselves in the lower levels, and continued fighting. Victory, it turned out, was subjective. Wyatt learned things during those 2 weeks. He learned that sleep was optional when adrenaline and stimulants got involved. He learned that you could fit through any space if you were motivated enough, and didn't care about dignity. He learned that the human body could survive on ration bars, recycled water, and pure spite for an unreasonable amount of time. He learned what fear smelled like, what exhaustion tasted like, and what it felt like to shoot at living beings who were just following orders from people who'd never seen combat. He learned he was good at it, which was the worst lesson of all. The Coalition's tactical reports made for fascinating reading, assuming you enjoyed watching military strategists have nervous breakdowns in document form. Humans employed child soldiers. Investigation revealed those were fully grown adults. Humans were just disturbingly small. Humans used chemical weapons. Analysis showed it was tear gas, which humans deployed against their own civilians for crowd control. Humans committed perfidy by faking surrenders. Turns out they were actually surrendering, then escaping, then resuming fighting, because apparently surrender didn't mean what the Coalition thought it meant. The worst incident, the one that made it into Coalition history books with appropriate horror, involved the Third Battle of Armstrong Colony. The Coalition had the orbital high ground, controlled the supply lines, and had the human defenders completely surrounded. Textbook siege situation. Accept surrender, install garrison, move to the next target. The humans strapped 6 nuclear rockets to a nickel-iron asteroid, painted "Return to Sender" on the side in letters visible from orbit, and launched it at the Coalition fleet. It wasn't a weapon, it was barely a planet. It was spite compressed into kinetic energy, and it worked because the Coalition fleet was too busy calculating the probability that humans would actually do something that's suicidal to realize the humans were already doing it. 2 battleships destroyed, 1 crippled. The asteroid continued on its merry trajectory, and would eventually, in about 40,000 years, exit the system entirely. Humanity named it the Diplomatic Envoy, and tracked its position for posterity. The war dragged on. 3 years turned to 4, 4 turned to 5. The Coalition kept waiting for humanity to exhaust itself, to run out of ships, supplies, or soldiers. They didn't understand that humanity had been practicing warfare on themselves for 10,000 years, and had gotten horrifyingly efficient at. Earth had wars about religion, resources, ideology, and one notable conflict over a bucket. An actual bucket. Humans went to war over a wooden container and fought about it for 300 years. The Coalition had conflicts of interest resolved by arbitration committee. They weren't even playing the same sport. Wyatt rotated between 3 different combat zones, which the military called gaining valuable experience, and which he called attempting to die in multiple locations. He saw friends get killed by energy weapons that turned matter into plasma. He saw enemies die to good old-fashioned bullets, because humanity kept using them out of nostalgia and the fact that they worked. He earned medals for actions he couldn't remember clearly, his memory filing them under blur of violence, alongside hundreds of other incidents that all tasted the same. The Coalition's fighting doctrine was honor-bound, which meant stupid. Challenge an enemy to single combat. Honorable. Shoot them while they're reloading. Human. Fight to the last soldier. Glorious. Retreat. Regroup and blow up their supply depot from 3 kilometers away. Practical. The Coalition fought like they had something to prove. Humans fought like they had nothing to lose, which was different and substantially more effective. By year 5, the Coalition had lost more soldiers than the previous 10 conflicts combined. They controlled 17 strategic locations. Humanity controlled everything else, and contested the 17 out of sheer stubbornness. The war had achieved nothing except demonstrating that humans didn't know when to quit, mostly because quitting wasn't in the cultural vocabulary. The treaty negotiations took 8 months because the coalition kept proposing terms that assumed they'd won, and humanity kept pointing out that winning generally involved the other side admitting defeat. Eventually they settled on a compromise that satisfied no one, and guaranteed nothing except that both sides were too exhausted to keep fighting. The Outer Veil systems remained human territory. The coalition maintained its border. Everyone agreed to establish diplomatic channels, and try this thing called talking before shooting. Revolutionary concept. Wyatt heard the news in a field hospital on Europa, recovering from injuries he'd classify as medium bad on the scale of fine to very dead. The war was over. They'd won. Humanity had faced down the galaxy's greatest military power, and forced a stalemate, which historians would generously reframe as victory. Around him other soldiers celebrated with the muted enthusiasm of people too tired to properly care. Someone found alcohol that definitely violated medical protocols. Someone else started crying and wouldn't stop. Someone sat in the corner, staring at nothing, still fighting battles that had ended weeks ago. Wyatt felt nothing, which seemed appropriate. The war was over. The war was over. He repeated it like a mantra, waiting for it to mean something. 2 years after the treaty signing, Wyatt stood in downtown New Toronto receiving a medal he didn't want from a politician who'd never left Earth during the entire conflict. The ceremony involved speeches about sacrifice and valor, neither of which captured the reality of shooting at people who were also just trying to not die. The crowd cheered at appropriate moments. Children waved flags. Someone's grandmother thanked him for his service, and he nodded because what else do you say? You're welcome for the trauma. The medal was heavy. Not metaphorically heavy, actually heavy, like they'd decided valor should have substantial weight. It joined 3 others in a drawer at home, where they clinked against each other whenever he opened it looking for socks. Sometimes he considered throwing them away. Mostly he just closed the drawer quickly and pretended they didn't exist. Employment proved tricky. Turns out expert in small unit tactics and asymmetric warfare didn't translate well to civilian job markets. He tried construction, but the sound of pneumatic tools sent him diving for cover twice before he accepted that maybe building things wasn't his calling. He tried warehouse work, which was fine until a forklift backfired and he spent 20 minutes in the bathroom trying to remember that forklifts weren't coalition hover tanks and the warehouse wasn't under attack. Eventually he found work in logistics coordination, pushing digital containers around virtual warehouses, which was mind-numbingly boring and therefore perfect. Nothing exploded. Nobody died. The most stressful part of his day was explaining to customers why their package was delayed, and even that beat explaining to command why half your squad wasn't coming back. The apartment was fine, 1 bedroom, kitchenette, bathroom with a door that didn't seal properly. He'd lived in worse during the war, which was a depressing metric for evaluating housing. He kept it sparse because decorating felt pointless, and also because too much furniture meant too many places someone could hide, which he logically knew was absurd and yet checked anyway every time he came home. Sleep happened in 3-hour blocks, interrupted by dreams that weren't quite nightmares but weren't pleasant either. Just replays of events with slight variations. What if he'd moved left instead of right? What if that shot had landed 3 centimeters different? What if? The therapist called it hypervigilance. He called it exhausting. Dating was a disaster. First date went fine until she asked what he did during the war, and he made the mistake of answering honestly. Nothing graphic, just factual. But apparently combat operations in contested territory, translated to please never contact me again in civilian. Second date he lied, said he did supply chain management, which was technically true if you counted ammunition as supply. She figured out he was lying when he instinctively mapped the restaurant's exits and defensive positions. There wasn't a third date. Other veterans had it worse. Some had it better. The ones who went straight into military contracting seemed to adapt fine, channeling their experience into corporate security and asking fewer questions about ethics. The ones who went into police work either thrived or washed out spectacularly when they realized domestic peacekeeping wasn't combat, and you couldn't treat civilians like hostages. Some went back to school, pursuing degrees that might make the whole thing worthwhile in retrospect. Some didn't make it at all. The memorial services were always well attended, full of people trying to make sense of surviving a war only to lose the peace. Nobody knew what to say because there wasn't anything to say. They'd made it through 5 years of hell and couldn't handle the quiet afterward. It made a terrible kind of sense. Wyatt attended a support group every Thursday because the alternative was not attending and pretending everything was fine, which had stopped working around months. The group met in a community center that smelled like old coffee and good intentions. Dozen people, give or take, all veterans, all managing their own versions of the same problem. Nobody talked about heroism. Nobody glorified mostly they talked about grocery stores being too bright, traffic noise sounding like incoming fire, and the surreal disconnect between what they'd done and where they were now. One guy couldn't handle crowds. Another couldn't tolerate silence. Someone admitted they kept a rifle under their bed, unloaded, just to feel safe. Someone else said they'd thrown all their weapons away and still felt like they were carrying one. The counselor, a former army doctor who'd seen the war from field hospitals, didn't offer solutions because there weren't any, just strategies for management, coping mechanisms, and the occasional reminder that feeling broken didn't mean being broken, though the distinction felt academic at 3 in the morning. Humanity's economy had rebounded. The war industries contracted after the treaty, throwing thousands out of work, but civilian manufacturing expanded to fill the gap. Turns out the same factories that built warships could build colony vessels, and the same people who designed weapons could design mining equipment productive, profitable, and nobody had to die. Revolutionary. The galactic community treated humanity differently now. No more condescension, no more demands, just careful politeness and a healthy amount of fear masquerading as respect. Trade agreements got negotiated quickly. Border disputes got resolved diplomatically. Nobody wanted round 2 because round 1 had been educational enough. Wyatt watched the news sometimes, seeing humanity's representatives at galactic forums, shaking appendages with species they'd been shooting at years prior. Diplomats talked about mutual cooperation and shared prosperity, using words like partnership instead of don't make us do that again. It was progress, probably. It certainly beat warfare, but watching ships launch for trade missions to former enemy territories felt surreal. The same species that had tried to glass human colonies now imported human music, human art, human cuisine. Cultural exchange, they called it, making friends through shared interests rather than shared trauma. Novel concept. Wyatt tried going to the spaceport once, watching the ships come and go, trying to feel something about humanity's place in the galaxy. Pride, maybe, or satisfaction. Instead, he watched a civilian transport depart for Euthani space, and remembered the Battle of Titan Station, where Euthani gravity weapons had collapsed an entire habitat section, killing 300 people instant. He remembered the sound, the screaming, the impossibility of helping anyone when the physics decided to stop making sense. The transport climbed toward orbit, running lights blinking peacefully. Regular scheduled service, routine as breathing, progress. He went home, opened the drawer with the medals, looked at them for a long moment, then closed it again. Maybe someday they'd mean something. Maybe someday he'd understand what they'd won and whether it was worth what they'd paid. Thursday came around again. He went to group. Someone new had joined, fresh from discharge, still wearing their service posture like armor. Younger than Wyatt had been, which shouldn't have been possible but was. They looked lost in that specific way everyone in the room recognized. The counselor made introduction. The new arrival asked the question. They all asked eventually, "Does it get better?" The room went quiet, because nobody wanted to lie but nobody wanted to tell the truth either. Better was relative. Better than the first month. Absolutely. Better than before the war. That person didn't exist anymore, so the comparison was meaningless. "It gets different," Wyatt said finally. "Different's the best I can promise." The kid nodded like that made sense, which it didn't, but would eventually. They'd all learned the same lesson. Victory wasn't an end, it was just a different kind of middle, and the middle lasted a lot longer than anyone expected. 5 years post-treaty, the galaxy had developed opinions about humanity. Academic opinions, mostly, published in journals with titles like Tactical Innovation in Asymmetric Conflict, and Cultural Factors in Human Military Doctrine. Alien military academies added human case studies to their curriculum. War colleges analyzed human strategies with the enthusiasm of scholars, discovering a new philosophical school, completely missing the point that human tactics weren't innovation, they were desperation, with better market. The Ethani published a 3,000-page analysis of human psychological warfare, concluding that humans possessed an innate capacity for creative violence, unmatched in known species. They meant it as academic observation. It read like a warning label. The coalition had disbanded. Sort of. The member species still cooperated on trade and technology sharing, but the military alliance had quietly dissolved into mutual defense pacts that carefully avoided mentioning who they were defending against. Nobody said humanity out loud, but the treaties all had clauses about respecting territorial sovereignty and resolving disputes through dialogue, which was diplomatic code for let's not do that again. Wyatt didn't follow galactic politics closely. He had enough trouble managing planetary existence, but he couldn't entirely avoid it either. Not when every news cycle featured humanity's growing influence, trading partnerships, cultural exchanges, and the general sense that humanity had arrived on the galactic stage. Whether the galaxy wanted them there or not, work had become routine, which was either progress or stagnation, depending on how generous his mood was. He'd gotten promoted to senior coordinator, which meant the same job with slightly better pay and marginally more responsibility. His apartment had acquired furniture, actual decorations, and a plant that was somehow still alive despite his best efforts at neglect. Small victories. Thursday group continued. The faces changed as people moved on, moved away, or stopped coming for reasons nobody discussed. New veterans filtered in. The war far enough in the past that some of them had enlisted after it ended, served their tours in peacetime garrisons, and still came back struggling with the cultural whiplash of military to civilian transition. Trauma wasn't exclusive to combat, turned out, just more obvious. The veteran from 2 years ago, the kid who'd asked if it got better, was doing okay. Working as an instructor at a community college, teaching history to students who thought the war was ancient rather than recent. They'd found a partner who didn't mind the nightmares, and even understood when social events became overwhelming. Progress looked different for everyone. Wyatt had stopped expecting major revelations. No dramatic healing moment. No sudden clarity about meaning and purpose. Just incremental improvements and occasional setbacks. A portfolio of coping strategies that worked more often than they failed. He slept in 4-hour blocks now, which was practically luxurious. Restaurants still made him nervous, but he could usually manage an hour before needing to leave. Crowds remained terrible, so he avoided them and nobody died from his absence. The spaceport had become his accidental retreat. Oddly enough, he'd started going weekly, then twice weekly, watching ships arrive and depart with their cargo of people who had places to be and reasons to go there. The constant motion felt purposeful in a way civilian life often didn't. It was there, on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, that he encountered a Helgrim standing at the observation deck, watching the same ships with the same inexplicable focus. The recognition was mutual and immediate, not personal but categorical. Veteran recognizing veteran across species lines. That particular posture of someone pretending to be fine while actively managing invisible weight. The Helgrim noticed him noticing, and for a long moment they both pretended they hadn't. Then the alien spoke, using a translation device that rendered their bioluminescent communication patterns into flat emotionless standard. The ships are calming, predictable pattern. Wyatt considered walking away, decided against it for reasons he couldn't articulate. Arrivals and departures. No surprises. I served on the HFY arbitrator, the Helgrim continued, unprompted. 4th Fleet. We were at Armstrong Colony. The name triggered instant recall. Armstrong Colony. The asteroid incident. Humans using nuclear weapons as delivery mechanisms for kinetic projectiles. Wyatt's unit had been 3 systems away, but everyone heard about Armstrong. You couldn't not hear about Armstrong. I heard about that, Wyatt said carefully. Must have been intense. Intense, the Helgrim repeated, and the translation couldn't capture whether that was agreement or irony. Humans strapped rockets to an asteroid. We calculated the trajectory, determined it was impossible, and were struck anyway. 2300 victory through impossibility. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Wyatt couldn't figure out if this was accusation, confession, or just statement of fact. I wasn't there, he offered finally. I survived. I returned home. I received honors for surviving, which seems incorrect. The asteroid missed my section by 70 meters. Geography, not valor. Medals for surviving, Wyatt said. Yeah, I've got a few of those. They stood in silence, watching a cargo hauler depart for the Outer Veil territories. Humanity's contested mining colonies, now thriving trade hubs. The war had preserved those systems, guaranteed humanity's independence, and cost both sides numbers that looked abstract in reports and devastating in reality. Do your people struggle afterward? The Helgrim asked. The war ended, but the veterans continue fighting. Some do, Wyatt admitted. A lot do. We've got support systems, therapy, medication, group sessions. Helps some, doesn't help others. You, the Helgrim, do not discuss such things. We process internally, achieve equilibrium, resume function. The translation rendered it matter-of-factly, but something in the alien's posture suggested the reality was more complicated. I come here twice weekly, the ships help. Yeah, Wyatt said. Another ship departed, this one heading for Prathos space, carrying manufactured goods and returning with refined materials. Trade, commerce, the boring machinery of peace that required both sides to acknowledge mutual benefit. It wouldn't erase the war, wouldn't resurrect the dead, wouldn't fix the broken, but it meant the next generation might grow up trading insults instead of weapons fire, which wasn't nothing. We won, the Helgrim said quietly. Coalition forces achieved all strategic objectives, maintained territorial integrity, forced humanity to accept diplomatic frameworks. Victory. We won, Wyatt echoed. Humanity retained all contested systems, established autonomous governance, forced the coalition to recognize sovereignty. Victory. They both stood there, two winners from different sides, watching ships come and go, managing their respective versions of victory's aftermath. The Helgrim left first, offering a gesture that might have been farewell or acknowledgement. Wyatt watched them go, then turned back to the observation window. Another ship arriving, passenger transport from Earth, bringing people to the frontier territories that had been worth fighting for. Families, workers, colonists chasing opportunities that peace made possible. Young faces pressed against viewports, seeing the solar system for the first time, excited about the future they'd inherit. They'd learn about the war in school, memorize dates and outcomes, write essays about tactical innovations and diplomatic resolution. They wouldn't understand the cost, not really, and that was fine. That was the point. Wyatt's generation had paid in nightmares, broken relationships, inability to process loud noises, and medals that sat in drawers gathering dust. They'd bought peace with pieces of themselves they'd never get back. The kids arriving now would benefit from that purchase without understanding the price, and Wyatt found he was okay with that. Grateful. The galaxy studied human warfare, trying to reverse engineer tactical innovations for their own militaries. They analyzed battle strategies, psychological operations, asymmetric approach. They were building better weapons, designing improved countermeasures, preparing for the next conflict with lessons learned from the last one. They'd completely missed the actual lesson, which was that winning wars was easy compared to surviving them, that victory celebrations lasted days, while consequences lasted lifetimes, and that the price of triumph got paid in installments that never quite finished. But that was fine. Let them study tactics and strategies. Let them prepare for wars they'd hopefully never fight. Let them think humanity's innovation was the creative violence, rather than the stubborn insistence on surviving despite it. Wyatt checked the time, realized he'd been standing there for 2 hours, and headed for the transit station. Thursday group started in 90 minutes. He'd stop for coffee first. The good stuff from the place that didn't use machines that sounded like weapons charge. Small accommodations for invisible wounds, routine adjustments for manageable existence. The war was over. Humanity had won. The galaxy respected their sovereignty, traded with their merchants, and carefully avoided repeating the educational experience. And every Thursday, veterans gathered in a community center that smelled like coffee and good intentions, managing the victory, 1 week at a time, paying the price in installments that would last the rest of their lives. Different was the best anyone could promise. Different was, somehow, enough. Chat control.